all people.
Cool.
All right, guys, welcome to round 2 of Monash Australs. Without further ado, let's call upon Prime Minister. Yeah.
Okay, can I be heard? It has been around 3 years since the Me Too movement really kicked off, and it is still yet to give a platform or public support to a woman who earns less than $50,000 a year. It is catastrophically failing to represent the true reality of sexual assault and sexual harassment in like most of the developed world, and it has failed working class women. I'll do 3 things in this speech. Firstly, in setup, I'm going to explain what the movement has looked like so far, who we consider to be working class women, and what we consider to be failure for the context of this debate. Secondly, I'm going to do a comparative analysis of what we think the movement could have been to be more successful and how it has failed these women. And thirdly, why we think the working class women ought to be the priority of the Me Too movement. So, setup, what does the Me Too movement look like so far? I think there are 4 things to note here. Firstly, the women who are comparatively being the leaders of the movement, the ones who are getting the most attention, the ones who are coming forward as victims, are comparatively speaking, for the most part, whiter, wealthier, more privileged women than most working class women in the Western world in fairly high profile industries, particularly in the media and entertainment industry. Secondly, it relies on a mechanism of outing, vilification, targeting, and cancellation of very high profile, notorious sexual predators. Thirdly, it is incredibly individually focused, i.e. it targets individual men who did particular acts against a relatively small number of women. And fourthly, it is incredibly flashy in terms of the way it plays the media for headlines, for public attention, in a way to maximize its own political capital and its own support and public attention, and thus inflow things like donations and declarations of support. Second point of setup then is, who do we consider to be working class women for this debate? We think first thing to note is obviously that they are working class. They are obviously going to be poorer than most women who are benefited from the Me Too movement thus far. They are more likely to be racially diverse. They are more likely to live in suburbs on the outskirts of cities or in rural areas. And we think, importantly, they are significantly more likely to be harassed or sexually assaulted. Because of the fact that they are more economically vulnerable, i.e. a woman working at a fast food restaurant for a living is going to be significantly more vulnerable to any revenge for speaking up against her manager than, for instance, one of Harvey Weinstein's assistants. There is less scrutiny placed on these industries because the media industry reporting on itself obviously is a self-perpetuating cycle of outrage and clickbaiting headlines in a way that other industries cannot match. Thirdly, they are less credible most of the time in a court of law. They are seen as less reliable. They are less likely to be able to use the legal system to their advantage. And fourthly, they have less of a public platform. They are less able to mobilize a movement behind them. And what that means is that not only are they more vulnerable, but they're also significantly more likely to be ignored, as they have been thus far by the movement. Yeah. So finally, the final thing in setup then is what we would consider the bar of failure to be for this debate. We think it largely has 3 criteria. Firstly, that the movement currently focuses on a very small segment of society, as I flagged earlier, the media industry for the most part, with very few ventures into finance or politics, right? And we know that they have done this for self-interested reasons, right? They do this for the headlines. They do this in a way to pick their battles to maximize their support, but in doing so have abandoned working class women. Secondly, it is we consider failure to be distracting from overall pushes for structural reform because of the focus on individual cases that send the message that it was just Harvey Weinstein, and now that he's been excised from Hollywood, all of the culture is now magically going to be fixed overnight. We think that genuine pushes for structural reform, reforming non-disclosure agreements, is obviously not going to be as flashy, but we would say that would be far more important for these sorts of people. And thirdly, we think it is failed when it is deeply unrepresentative of what sexual assault and sexual harassment is likely to look like, when it steals the platform from women who are far more vulnerable and far more likely to be exposed to this in such a way that is deeply unrelatable for most women. It gives them very little solidarity. So then, on to the substantive. I'm going to now just do a comparative analysis of what the movement could have been and the ways in which it's failed. Okay, so the first thing to note here is that the movement would not have failed so badly if it originally started as an explicitly political movement. Because the important thing to note here is that the movement started roughly 3 years ago, but it still does not really have a political platform. It does not have any pushes for political reforms. It does not endorse political candidates as a cohesive movement, right? It is actively pursuing a big tent approach, trying not to alienate people, trying to just keep it focused on outing sexual predators who are obviously incredibly hated and vilified, who it is incredibly popular to pile onto, right? And that big tent approach basically means that they are like allowing their leverage to be unused. They are allowing their immense popularity to go to, like, effectively go to their heads and dictate the way that in which they act, because they are not going to try to be particularly controversial and push for things like, economic reform to make sure that women work in fewer like low wage, unsafe industries. They are not pushing for things like female unionization. They are not pushing for things like actively like platforming these women, because that would be controversial. That would lose them support. That would lose them an inflow of donations. Obviously, at that point, the movement has failed. The second thing to note here is that we would prefer a movement that more accurately represented what harassment would look like. And as I flagged earlier, poorer women are significantly more vulnerable to this because they are economically unable to retaliate, in more precarious positions where more people are likely to have like absolute power over their livelihoods, over whether they are able to like feed their families. They have significantly less like political clout. They have significantly less ability to get people to listen to them. They have limited networking abilities, and they have limited capital to be able to pursue things like legal recourse, like suing somebody for like damages. Obviously, that means, and as I've already flagged, at the point at which the movement largely focuses on like actresses who have come out against like big, like huge media moguls, because that is like flashier, that gets more headlines, that obviously like is more like beneficial to the movement as it currently is, that actively excludes a lot of these working class women because of the fact that they cannot relate to anything like this. The idea of like a film assistant being assaulted on a set that costs more than these people's families have ever earned over their collective lives by somebody who is worth more than like their entire neighborhood is literally like a completely alien concept. It is such an exclusionary feeling to know that, okay, maybe there is the commonality that both of us were sexually assaulted by somebody more powerful than us, but the like difference in wealth, the difference in power, the difference in scenario is such that most working class women will never be able to truly relate to that in any meaningful capacity. They're not going to be able to like understand or empathize in anywhere near the same capacity that the movement ought to if it were to truly not fail these women. What this means, though, is that the movement is fundamentally platforming the wrong people in a way that fails working women because of the fact that there's only a limited amount of like attention that is ever given at any one time to sexual assault and sexual harassment, right? Because people have like a limited amount of interest. People have like a limited ability to sort of get involved in these sorts of situations. Obviously, at the point at which actresses and like fairly famous, well-off women take up the majority of that, that excludes the poorer women in the working class. We ought not support that. Finally, it has made discourse significantly worse because it gives the false impression of growth, right? And it gives the false impression that we've now started removing some of the bad apples, and that means that society is overall getting better at an exponential rate, which is simply just not true, right? It is, while we think that this narrative is probably empowering to some extent for some women, it mostly absolves society of its sexist sins, right? And the flow-on messaging benefits that I'm sure Team Negative will try and push largely flow into other fairly professional industries like finance, like law. That is not working class women for the most part. That is going to continue to keep on failing them at the point at which the movement is unrepresentative. That is obviously something that we should not support. Finally, though, why should we prioritize the working class women over like wealthier women? As I already flagged, like platforms are a zero-sum, and attention are like a zero-sum game. There's only so much you can give. And at the point at which you have to make a choice between working class women or richer women, I think you ought side with the working class women who have suffered to a significantly greater degree. They have comparatively fewer possibilities to seek recourse via like legal mechanisms that I flagged earlier, right? The final thing you should take away, though, popularity is like very important for the Me Too movement, and it has obviously picked its battles in such a way that it maximizes its own popularity. But it has spent so long chasing this popularity and trying to be uncontroversial that it has actively left behind poor women of color who can never relate to it, who can never reap those benefits. And in doing that, it has failed these women. We're proud to affirm.
Right, I thank Prime Minister. Let's call upon Leader of Opposition here.
Hello, am I audible? Is that a yes? All right, wonderful.
Yep, yes.
I'll just fix my papers.
You're muted.
Right. All right.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Sorry, I muted after I asked if I was audible. All right. I'll start it in 3, 2, 1. Saying that we could have done more is not akin to failure. In fact, I think it's an incredibly low burden that affirmative has put upon themselves, that just saying because the movement has some degree of inequality, that it is simply no longer serving the interest of working class women. So I want to first assess whether or not, so I think rather the burden of affirmative was to assess whether or not the movement has acted in a way that is inimical to the interest of working class women, that I think they've yet to prove completely. Because that is not just whether or not they could have done more, but trying to compare what the alternative would have been, and the inability of them proving whether or not there would have been other forms of recourse already means that the movement, having not acted at all, is much less likely for them to be able to take the win in this debate. So firstly, they say that the movement has a great deal of inequality. The first thing I want to point out here is that it's unclear to me why proving that degree of inequality means the movement has already failed. In fact, I would make the explanation that a lot of privileged women who would have formerly instead taken a lot of institutional measures to be able to deal with their own cases of harassment, like maybe trying to course it to their HR and their PR agencies, like maybe trying to pursue a court case because they can afford a lot of very, very good lawyers, rather than trying to course it through movements and trying to make it a shared struggle, has instead, or would have instead, continued to make a lot of the platforms for trying to make sexual harassment and the ability to air out such issues much more inaccessible. I would say the ability to course it specifically through movements where you completely rely on the support of a lot of working class women to be able to stand behind you. When you work on, rely on these women to continue to back you because you might be a celebrity, because you need to be able to support them in their own instances of sexual harassment, is also good. But moreover, it is the use of that power such that other women were able to use that as platforms themselves too. It is the shared hashtag of Me Too where anyone can click it, where anyone can use it, and everybody can share their own personal and individual story that would have otherwise not been nearly as popular, not been nearly as supportive of bigger celebrities and other women not used it, that therefore it's dangerous for them. Secondly, they say you don't push for structural reform. And their only structural reason for this is to explain that it is controversial. Ladies and gentlemen, trying to come out with your own case and try to say that someone should be canceled because of sexual harassment is already controversial. And that is what working, or rather privileged women would have done otherwise on their side as well. If anything, I think a lot of the ability to hop on a lot of these platforms to explain your own unique struggles that otherwise would not have gotten nearly enough attention is much harder. I would say the comparative was simple. Before the Me Too movement, it was women underreporting and simply staying silent because they did not feel like it would succeed, or they didn't feel like it was sexual harassment at all because they were guilted to feel out of it, or trying to use institutional and legal mechanisms that often did not work in their favor because they couldn't access lawyers, because they didn't have a lot of these connections, that now the greater degree of public will and public sympathy has made it more accessible for them. 3 things from me. Number 1, might reduce the number of cases of sexual harassment. So first thing I want to talk about here, individual perpetrators. So a lot of them, I think in fact, do not know what the boundaries of harassment are, because the previous definitions are bounded out explicit instances of assault, explicit instances of rape, rather than a lot more gray area, which we've grown to identify because of the growing popularity of things like publication material for people who are part of the Me Too movement, or people sharing stories around much more maybe gray area things, like whether the woman was drunk, like touching inappropriately, that have now been recognized for a lot more individuals that would have otherwise thought this was an okay thing to do, that it was just flirting, particularly for working class women who have no other way to be able to share that kind of information, or don't have the institutional mechanisms to relay that information upon individuals, especially if they're at a disadvantage and at a power imbalance from their office, like larger officers. But secondly, is that even if they were aware, it is them being evil and actively doing it that we have now tied to a lot of public incentives. And take note, you don't have to be a very rich woman. The fact that you could out your boss and maybe their family would find out, that maybe their kids would find out, that maybe people will start trying to fire him or would not want to be able to support your company any longer because there's increasing traction for your tweet that came out about your instance of sexual assault with him, are far more likely to either preemptively prevent these cases from happening, because even if they are evil, we at the very least make sure they have in their self-interest not want to face that kind of backlash. That is a good outcome, at least, even if it's not like principally going to change them, right? But secondly, I think their misconception that you don't try and change institutions is simply wrong. A lot of these movements have attempted to create greater policy precisely because there's a signaling effect that even if we can catch one individual only, it's that all other individuals are afraid that they're no longer serving the duty to protect, which is why the Me Too movement has targeted businesses, has targeted working women in schools, for example, that we feel would have otherwise not been able to act on this because they could have hid evidence, because there was no external pressure, and a lot of the internal institutional mechanisms are simply likely to be swept under the rug, are likely to side with the powers of the boss, etc., rather than try and get external pressure on these kinds of individuals. I think the comparative is simple. It is the ability to create outside and external factors like boycotting corporations who support and back bosses who are sexual harassers, for example, that we feel are far more likely to be effective for working class women in general. Secondly, legislation and policy change. So even assuming that you don't get the full range of what could have been protections for like working class women on our side, it is still that there is in status quo a lacking ability to be able to account for structural reform in general for sexual harassment. So I think there are many mechanisms that the Me Too movement has given in order to get greater traction for things like public legislation and policy change for them. One, it is the large traction because if especially it is used by a lot of richer, more privileged women, it gains much more media attention. It's more likely to gather people in support of this cause because they can use the resources for that. Secondly, they're more likely to do things like pursue cases rather than take on plea deals because they see the larger success of other individuals. And a lot of time these cases are used as important jurisprudence and ways to be able to get greater evidence for a lot of these women. But thirdly, it is the critique of public figures like Brett Kavanaugh to be able to ensure that they don't anymore work in public office, etc. And this is where we engage with a lot of the material coming from First Half. It is that even if the impetus comes from very rich and privileged women, a lot of the change in legislation that we're able to get is more likely to be widespread. They just assert that this doesn't happen. Take note, if it takes into account large political figures who are also in charge of legislation and policy change, which is why people don't want to be able to put sexual harassers in office or in Congress, is much greater impetus, or at least shifts the overton window to be able to account for more cases of sexual harassment, and therefore disproves their claim. Because even if you work for a corporation that does not support it, at least wider legislation will force them to support it, force them to be able to adopt regulation and action that is far better. Lastly, what's better for individual women? They just assert that you cannot relate. Take note, the alternative was not that you need to have incredibly specific ability to be able to relate to all the circumstances. It is that often a lot of these women feel very guilty. A lot of these women feel very alone in their instances and cases of sexual harassment. That the Me Too movement uniquely has given them an opportunity, because particularly for working class women who might not be able to afford therapy, who might not be able to access so many different support groups at different points in time, it is often Twitter, social media, and other ways the movement has coalesced that they need to be able to support them. And this is multiple ways to make sure that it is better, because the lasting side effects of sexual harassment are often psychological. So even if we can't get institutional change, it is the ability, for example, to number one, feel like you're not alone. And doesn't engage with the fact that this comes, like, even if it's only stories that are shared by incredibly privileged women, it is the fact that no matter how powerful you are, and you can still be a victim of harassment, that especially for working class women, they feel more justified in their ability to feel victimhood rather than saying they could have done more, that they should have exerted more power rather than feel hopeless and feel like they were like completely out of, like, they were in full agency of the situation. Secondly, it is like you feeling like there are many individuals, so this is normal, that there's an act of victimization against a lot of women, not just you. So you shouldn't feel particularly guilty, that it's not particularly your fault. But lastly, it is more so the ability to process these individual cases that you cannot get if you can't have access to mental health institutions, bosses who support you, a wide range of support groups that often only privileged women are able to get. I'm very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition. Let's call upon Deputy Prime Minister here.
Let's be very clear about this debate. The comparative in this debate is not a world without Me Too or with less reporting of sexual harassment in the workplace. All the benefits that they spent a long time talking about women feeling more empowered or certain women feeling more represented or coming forward, all of that exists on our side. And as the affirmative team, we don't need to regret Me Too. We don't need to deplatform famous actresses talking about their experiences or undermining their horrific experiences. And we don't need to take back the prosecution of Harvey Weinstein or anything like that. What we need to prove is that a movement that purports to broadly address and better sexual harassment, therefore has a responsibility to do so. And it forgets a massive victim group of working class women. And as intersectional feminists in the Me Too movement, we should care more about these women because of their greater comparative vulnerability. That they don't care about those women and that they actually take the spotlight away from them is a failure. And although we don't need to prove an active harm, because that's not our burden in this debate, we will do so. And that's what I'm going to do in my speech. Firstly, I just want to quickly talk about, again, what the Me Too movement looks like, what it has done, and how it actually works. And then secondly, I'm going to run through 3 clear, tangible failures of the Me Too movement. So firstly, what does the Me Too movement look like and what has it done? The negative spent a lot of time talking about what the Me Too movement has done for women, mainly that you're empowered to participate in a hashtag on Twitter and express yourself and get attention. That mechanism does not work for working class women, and it only works when a public figure has been outed in a public industry. What it looks like and how it functions is that the media will, focus on a specific isolated incident of a public figure and out them when there's been some sort of scandal in a movie industry, for example, and then other people are encouraged to kind of share their stories in the timeline in that same small pocket of time where the news cycle is suddenly giving them attention. Working class women do not have access to this mechanism in the sense that publicizing your harassment doesn't actually do anything for them because it has no legal outcomes, it has no structural outcomes. So 2 things. Firstly, even if those women are more empowered to speak out and maybe tweet about it, there's no material advantage to them doing that. But what it looks like is it makes the other people feel like that, they've told their story and therefore that is a solution in itself. That is what the Me Too movement suggests, and that is harmful. But secondly, we don't even think that working class women are necessarily more empowered to speak out. And we don't think that a hashtag on Twitter makes it any more possible for them to do so because it ignores the nature of the industry they work in. If they work in hospitality, for example, nobody cares if their manager or their co-worker at McDonald's assaulted them. We also think that it's not more possible for them to come forward because they don't feel represented. When you see Reese Witherspoon on the Today Show talking about how she was harassed on the film set, and the producer was talking about how attractive she was, and that's why they wanted to harass her, and she felt very victimized. That is a horrific experience. But women who are working in working class environments don't feel represented by that, and they're not going to feel more empowered to speak out as a result of that. They are also much more vulnerable to the extent that if they do tell their story, that is not actually going to benefit them. The whole reason that women don't come forward is that it is incredibly harmful for them to do so because they're financially vulnerable. If you come out against your boss, you'll probably just be fired and you have no legal recourse because the Me Too movement provides no reasons to do so. In fact, it's incredibly harmful because more reporting in a world or in an industry that doesn't care about reporting, doesn't care about your instance of sexual harassment, doesn't actually do anything. What the Me Too movement actually then does for these women is it forces them or expects them to tell them their stories publicly to get any change. It expects them to re-traumatize themselves like Christine Blasey Ford did in the Senate hearings for Brett Kavanaugh. And tells them that in order to get any change, they need to re-traumatize themselves and tell their stories, and then maybe there could be an outcome. But the very example that they wanted to invoke actually proves our point because Brett Kavanaugh is literally sitting on the Supreme Court. So the way that the Me Too movement functions and works means that it is about sensationalizing. It means that telling your story is an end in itself, and that mechanism just doesn't work for working class women and actually harms them in incredibly tangible ways. What are the 3 key failures that Sam told you about that I'm going to reiterate? The first is that there's a lack of political impetus. And we do think that in an alternative world that Sam wanted to talk about, that if Me Too movement was a political movement, that would better circumstances and recourse for working class women, because we think that a movement that is so built on fame and public platforming that fails to align itself with political figures and push for reform and trades off political and legal change for the perception of a purified industry and for headlines and to avoid controversy is failing working class women. The negative wanted to just argue that more media attention increases traction, increases critique of public figures, and maybe increases legal reform. They didn't actually explain why that is true. It actually ignored the bulk of Sam's speech, which is that there has been no legislative change, there has been no push for reform. Rather, it's just about solving, purifying the industry of Hollywood. And multiple people are still committing assaults every single day in industries that have no attention placed on them because there's no structural change. They need to prove that that is not true, and they can't because it is its truth. The second key failure that we pointed to is the idea of misrepresentation. Working class women are much more likely to experience harassment, and harassment also and victimization generally is also more likely to fall along class lines and racial lines. What that means is that a woman of color working in the hospitality industry doesn't feel represented by these women, but in fact is more likely to feel alienated because she does not feel like her experience is comparable. She doesn't feel like if she speaks out, anybody will care because nobody's going to put a camera in her face when she does. In fact, it's much more harmful for her to tell her story. We think that when the movement of Me Too purports to care about workplace harassment and purports to care about these people, then when these people who it purports to care about feel alone, do not feel represented, and in fact are excluded from the conversation, that is a failure. And I don't think we need to explain the semantics of what failure is for that to be blatantly true. The third and key failure of the Me Too movement and in the ways that it has failed working class women is that it has changed discourse for the worse. It has changed discourse for the worse in two key ways. The first one is that it platforms the wrong people. As Sam explained, there is a finite media attention span. There is, a short term level of interest in sexual harassment and in these cases. And if some people are speaking, then other people can't speak. There are key voices in the movement of workplace harassment who have been working on these things for years, people who work, in legal reform and things like that, who are necessarily left out of the conversation in place of people like Reese Witherspoon or Oprah. And it is not that Reese Witherspoon or Oprah have not had experiences that they have the right to talk about, but they have comparatively much more power and should be leveraging it. And the fact that they don't, to kind of center themselves in the conversation rather than people who are much more broadly affected is a failure and platforms the wrong people and takes attention away from people and excludes them from the conversation. The second way in which discourse has been harmed is the appearance that the problem is being solved. If it appears that sexual harassment is being, looked at on a large scale because we expose the complicity of all of the people who were who had knowledge of Harvey Weinstein's abuse, for example, then actual industry, especially industries that haven't been spotlighted, lose incentives to change anything, lose incentives to implement reform. They already have very little incentive to do so. This is an active harm that they lose the incentive to do so. And the notion that we just change norms and attitudes and change the way that people treat women in the workplace rather than putting in structural change is incredibly harmful for people whose only option is a structural legal form of recourse because nobody cares what they have to say because they're so vulnerable. We care about these women the most in this debate, and we believe that the Me Too movement has failed them. So proud to affirm.
Well, I thank the Deputy Prime Minister. Let's call upon the LFA.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, let me just fix my notes. I'll broadly do three things in my speech. The first is explain why the Me Too movement has fought for structural change and why if we're able to win that issue, we win the debate already. Secondly, why the current formulation of the Me Too movement is better than the alternatives that they propose in representing the working class. And lastly, why even if we believe that the Me Too movement only privileges work and only benefits privileged women right now, why the indirect benefits derived from that empowerment will lead to the improvement of the working class too, in which case we engage their best form of the argument and still take the debate. But before this, I want to clarify, just because my GPA is 3.6 and could have been potentially been 3.7, 3.8, or 4, means it could potentially be better, does not mean I failed in my academic curriculum, right? Arguments coming from net affirmative that just say there are potential ways it could have been better does not explain their burden, which is to prove why it failed altogether, which is either to prove why, one, working class people were harmed or not benefited at all by the movement, or B, that there's a clear compelling alternatives that they have is significantly better. Absent them being able to do that, they cannot take this debate. Firstly, then, does the Me Too movement fight for policy change? So the only analysis they provide are two things. They first say that the Me Too movement is only focused on the media. That is not true. There's also Me Too reports with respect to academicians or academics, professors, for instance, in Malaysia and in the Philippines. You have Me Too movement also talking about things like the Uber head and in the tech space like Google, for instance. So it's unclear whether or not the Me Too movement is restricted by the media. There is no actual structural analysis coming from affirmative explaining why this is true. But secondly, they suggest that the Me Too movement is limited because it only focuses on individualized stories. There are two responses to this. The first is it's not true. A lot of the Me Too movement also calls out people who are complicit in allowing the culture of the Me Too movement. So even if initially it started by calling out individual stories, they now realize it's not enough to call out individual perpetrators, but people who are shield perpetrators. That's why allies of these perpetrators are also called out and institutionalized as greater. Secondly, if a lot of people come out with their stories, presumably then it calls for some structural change because it elucidates information that more people are actually involved with this. But lastly, the nature of the hashtag #MeToo is that other people are involved too. That it's not an individual thing, but other people have the same plights. That's why it's Me Too, right? So presumably then they recognize these structural barriers that other people are able to face, and that's why we're able to get structural change. The last analysis they say is, well, there has not been any legislation. Note a lot of these sexual harassment legislations and laws that are now being passed, particularly in developing countries where they did not have them before. Even if you don't talk about it in a legal level, the fact that a lot of institutions, universities, for instance, updating their sexual harassment policy, the fact that they create gender hub, gender sensitivities, or gender committee in multiple different areas shows that we're able to get institutional change. The importance of this issue is that even if we lose the second issue, as I will talk about later, about representing minority groups or representing the working class, institutional and structural change helps everyone across the board. And note that the lack of response to all the levels of analysis coming from my first negative speaker imply that we get the structural change and therefore also empower the working class they want to talk about under their side of the house. The second thing they then say is, this movement does not represent the working class. So there are two things I want to note here. One, this has to be comparative to what either the status quo prior to the movement or B, the potential alternatives that I identified earlier. We said prior to the movement, the likely comparative is not an inclusive world where working class women are likely to be heard. On both sides of the house, working class people are underprivileged and therefore they're still unlikely to be heard. But now there's even more silence, more fear for them to come out because they feel like there's no one who's willing to come out and they'll be silent if they do so. In a world with the Me Too movement, we're able to open it. Then they identified two alternatives, which I honestly think are relatively contradictory, but let's deal with them anyway. The first they say is the Me Too movement should have been a political force or a political movement or a political party. One, if it started as a political force and political party, note that you cannot fiat that they had traction from the beginning. Meaning to say, they did not have the political power that a lot of people were willing to talk about, that a lot of celebrities supporting them because they said they wanted to focus more to be more political. This implies that they'll have to either A, not get representation, not be represented by the political system, or B, have to rely on rich, powerful allies in the political system, the political elites and the political parties that they want to identify under their side, because these are the people who move the wheel of politics, especially in developing countries where political dynasties, political families who control oligarchs, who control a lot of the political power are the people you have to tie into. To a degree, prop is against people aligning with people in power. This is significantly worse because they have complete say over the political policies that exist under their side of the house. The second alternative they suggest is we should have just focused on working class women immediately and exclusively. So not talk about the stories of other class or privileged women for the reason they say there's a finite sphere of resources. Firstly, we would suggest that this is a not sustainable strategy for the reason that it's unlikely to be able to get the traction. All their analysis explaining why women who are working class are likely to be discriminated means that if they came out to their stories without rich, privileged women coming out to their stories too, presumably they will not have been listened to, presumably they will not have been getting traction, and presumably the perpetrators of sexual harassment are far more willing to say, quash them, make them sign plea deals, try to harass them with libel lawsuits because they have no capacity to defend themselves. This means that the Me Too movement, as a nascent stage, would have likely collapsed and would have not likely been successful. And therefore, even if you believe that they had representation in the short run for some women, the vast majority of the other working class women would have not been able to be represented. But secondly, what's the comparative? They say that there's a finite number of space for women to talk, and that's why it's better for us to prioritize underclass women. This is simplistic. It being finite does not mean it's the same on both sides. We suggest that when privileged women speak out and they platform the issue, there's a greater space for people to talk about it, in which case even working class women are able to talk about their stories too. Note how a lot of the movement started with privileged women privileged people in that movement starting. The LGBT movement started being predominantly done by gay men or white gay men who were relatively more palatable, quote unquote, to the mainstream society and able to get their voice. But over time, intersectionality grows. The feminist movement itself started with white women first, and over time allowing space for intersectionality to happen. And the reasons why it cannot start with intersectionality in the first place is the amount of political capital you have on your side would have unlikely made it successful, and therefore not able to get the change that you want. But secondly, a lot of the protections that upper class women are able to provide, like being able to willingly to donate their lawyers, willing to donate to NGOs to make sure that if a working class individual will likely want to file a lawsuit and is sued for libel or harassed by their employer, they're able to go out or get jobs particularly. We would suggest then it's better that the Me Too movement mixes both the working class and rich individuals. Note that the Me Too movement doesn't prevent working class individuals from telling their stories. And over time, these stories are likely to be heard for the reason that the media will probably get run dry of the privileged stories. So presumably they then have to listen to more diversified stories on their side of the house. But the last thing I want to then go is even if they're true that it only privileges the working class people, note the crippling power of sexual harassment. It means that people are unlikely to go to work because they're afraid to be harassed, or the deterrence to fight for more rights or more protections or more privileges in the workspace or promotions because they feel like they'll be harassed by their boss or they have to do it after harassment. But lastly, it's just that women who are successful are likely to be labeled as sleeping with their bosses, are likely to be labeled as women who didn't deserve it but only got it because they slept their way to the top. Why is this important? Know that under our side, even if only privileged women are able to access greater spheres of power because they're now able to get higher jobs, higher business paying, higher political employment because they're more willing to enter in the workspace, they now open the floor for other underprivileged women. This is doing things like creating women-only companies or pro-women companies, doing things like donating to NGOs that care for women's interests and therefore trickle down to working women as a whole. Doing things like creating women's political parties later on when they do have the political traction and they do have the support to get it later on. We would suggest all of these things then trickle down, but would have not been able to do so if a lot of women were taken out from the systems of power. At the end of the speech, on both sides, working class women are underprivileged. It is a question of whether they're comparatively better, and we would suggest that the Me Too movement has been able to fulfill that, and that's why we're very proud to indicate. Thank you.
Highlighting the Deputy Leader of Opposition, let's call upon Government Whip. Yeah.
There is not a single woman in the world that does not have a story of sexual violence or sexual harassment. And that's a pretty scary anecdote because what it suggests is that there are lots and lots of stories that have not been told even because of the Me Too movement. The reason why that's important is because working class women make up the majority of women across the world. That's the nature of what it means by the 1% or the top 5% of people that we're talking about whose stories are shared in these debates. The movie stars, the high profile individuals, the high profile women do make up the top end. And statistically, they're a much smaller pool of people than this team is willing to accept. So when we talk about the Me Too movement failing, we're talking about three things. We're talking about, firstly, a misdiagnosis of the problem, that it is an isolated experience or an isolated incidence of failure, and an unwillingness to accept that it is actually a comprehensive culture of sexual violence that has been defended for generations that has led to these problems. It's secondly, that the Me Too movement misprescribed the solution. It said, go on social media and share the fact that you are also a victim of sexual violence, and this will make it better. This will make structural reform happen. That sharing and building these isolated solutions is the way to fix these problems in a world where it is structurally ingrained into every part of our society. And the third failure was that they forgot about the people who most needed them, which are the women at the bottom end of the per capita or per year, the amount of money that they make. They are the poorest women. They are the women of color whose stories are forgotten, whose stories are ignored. So when this team says, oh, hey, it's okay, they did a good job, and the affirmative team says that we lose because they didn't do it perfectly. No. The Me Too movement failed working class women, and to this very day continues to fail working class women in every single thing that they do. I'm going to talk through 3 issues in this speech. Firstly, on the question of why is it that the Me Too movement's approach and unwillingness to adapt to becoming a political entity constitutes a comprehensive change. Secondly, why discourse and the appearance of change is in and of itself problematic. And finally, why working class women are more vulnerable. And so the net benefit that could have been brought to them necessarily when impacted must mean that they have failed if they are not paid attention to. Firstly, what do we hear from this negative team in terms of the problems with our case? They say that we say there's a focus on media and provide no structural reasons to back it up. I'll give you the structural reasons. It's firstly, if we focus on high profile individuals, we're going to get more clicks. We're going to get more followers. There you go. The bigger the movement is, the more it is able to share its platform, the more people it gets to share that too. So it got them the most views in the beginning. And you know what? They were smart. They recognized it's important that we have a lot of people in the beginning support this movement and identify it. But this team just never engages with the analysis we give you at SAM and continue into Gen, which says that the movement is popular enough. It is time to make that change away from the focus on media towards other industries. And even if it is not true that they have only targeted musicians or actresses or film directors, it is always true that it is high profile individuals, because those are the people that build the movement and make it more popular, that build that platform. Secondly, they say that it's not about isolated cases. It's about addressing the entire culture. But then they go on to give the response that, well, we also go after the people that shield these people that do bad things. Like we also go after the circle around Harvey Weinstein and we cancel them as well. But that's just a slightly more expansive version of what an isolated case is. That is 1 degree removed from a person who has done horrific things. It is in no way a comprehensive approach. It is necessarily about isolated cases. And that is the problem that we identify and say is crucial in this debate. Thirdly, they say that, and this is ludicrous, that even if we don't actually target or attack structural problems, we get to identify them because everyone is sharing their stories and therefore we know where the problems are. But panel, we knew where the problems were when this movement first started 3 years ago, and we've known for decades. It's about the cultural history of sexual violence. It's things like the absence of abortion laws for instances of assault or other sexual violences. It's things like improved reporting mechanisms, and we know and have known what those structural changes are and what those structural changes needed to be for a very, very long time. No amount of more sharing was going to let us understand those things any better than we already do. And so there is the problem. It is that they focus on high profile individuals. They focus on an approach which is about isolated cases, and they really only slightly help identify structural reasons more. They don't actually target them. They don't actually solve them. Why is that problematic? Which is the second issue on the question of discourse. It's because there is then the appearance of growth and change in the absence of real growth and real change. And the change is there to some extent. Yeah, you've purified some industries. In media, lots and lots of people have been cancelled and removed. They no longer have that platform or that livelihood. In music, the same is true. In acting, the same is true. But as Jen tells you and Sam reiterates at the very, very beginning of our speech, high profile individuals are in another world, a totally different world. And this team says, oh, but that's the reason why we needed to start with them, because those are the people that can use the lawyers and can go and do the cases against these people. But no, you're thinking about that incorrectly. We say that if you want to put the burden or the onus on the poorest women in society to take to Twitter and recidivize and relive their trauma and their experience in order to build that movement, then put that onus on the top people as well. And even better than that, those people have access to the lawyers, access to the support networks, access to the bigger platform that will help them to do that. So by this team's analysis, that is a failure in and of itself to focus on high profile individuals. But the flow-on problem that comes out here as well is that the discourse is then, we are making movement, we are making progress. But is that true? The statistics don't reflect that. And even though the Me Too movement is incredibly popular and has encouraged a lot of discussion and sharing, the question of whether or not we have tried to address the root causes of these problems is very, very much there. So what else do we tell you? We tell you that it gives the platform to the wrong people. And popularity was always the #1 priority in the beginning, because the stories that are shared in that part of the Me Too movement's history are the biggest profile cases, got them the most followers. Now, this team says, no. The good thing about Me Too and the reason why working class women are empowered by it is because when Me Too got big, well, now everyone had a platform to share. Are you kidding me? That's ludicrous. The fact that this team thinks that the way to feel validated or supported by a society or a movement is to take to Twitter and relive and assert your experience as a victim of sexual violence. This team says, yay, we get to let them experience the trauma again. No, the onus is never and should never be on those people. And the fact that this is the way that the Me Too movement did it means that that is the expectation now, that if you do not share, you are not a real victim of sexual violence. That is incredibly problematic and incredibly traumatizing. Let's talk about now why working class women are the most vulnerable and why it's necessarily a failure that they've slipped through the cracks. We gave you 4 structural reasons as to why they are weaker and why they are necessarily less empowered than women at the top end of society. They're less politically empowered. They are not represented. They self-select out of even being able to run in things like politics because of social conditioning. It's the same problem that we've had in STEM for generations, just apply it to politics. Secondly, they are less economically empowered. There are $10 trillion worth of unpaid labor that go towards women all across the world. Just last year, they're disempowered either by the fact that they don't get promotions because they are not selected by a sexist boss or because they self-select out themselves. They have a smaller public platform. They don't have 10 million followers on Instagram or Twitter to share their story to. And finally, and most importantly, there are just more of them, purely on the numbers. Yeah, like if the top 5% is all the people whose stories are shared, think about the bottom 50% of whom there are many, many more. They are less heard, they are less vulnerable. So what did we need? We needed that. Even in the worst case, the platform that Me Too created was going to be given to these women. We've never seen that. We have never heard Me Too share or use its power to be able to let one of those women tell their stories. 2, they needed to have the courage that they expected of their members to become a political force, to oppose bills, to propose change, to embrace progressivism rather than the cowardice of apoliticism, to back candidates, to sponsor and support other social movements. And they needed to accurately depict harassment. So at the end of this speech, and indeed at close to the end of this debate, what you need to remember is that an imperfect approach that forces people to recidivize and relive their experience that is traumatizing and that does not fix the source of the problem is never good enough. And more than that, it was always a failure.
Well, I think I'm with any substantive speeches. Let's have opposition with him.
Hello, can I be seen and heard?
Yep.
Okay. All right, I'm going to start. 3, 2, 1. 3 issues in this debate. Firstly, where will we represent working class women more? Where are they able to speak out more? Secondly, where do we get better structural change? Lastly, where do we get psychological healing for these women? First issue, where do we represent working class women better? They said the Me Too movement should have focused on poor working class women from the start. Thus, it would give them more voice. Currently, they can't speak out. Firstly, you have to look at their own characterization. Using their own logic, These are poor, underprivileged women, people who have no voice in society, people who have no political or social capital to be able to speak out or do lots of other things. If we listen to their own characterization, if the Me Too movement started by focusing on poor working class women, no one would have listened, right? No one would have cared. It would have never trended on Twitter. No one would have ever heard of the Me Too movement ever existing, because it's towards people that society doesn't care about. Because it's about people the media would never have covered and all these things. More than all of this, it's incredibly likely if it started with working class women, firstly, they would be silenced by their bosses, right? Their bosses would have silenced them, never allowed them to speak out. Secondly, they would likely be stigmatized, right? Because it's so uncommon for people to be talking about their sexual harassment cases in public. It's likely they don't have the political or social capital to be able to do that. They likely incur social harms. We told you, it's only through when the rich people were able to speak out, the rich people were able to get the media attention, that we were able to actually allow this platform to exist. It's because rich people normalized people talking about their harassment cases that now even working class women can talk about this. It's because they made the Me Too movement get so much media attention, so much political attention, that that movement now exists. Their alternative likely wouldn't exist using their own logic and their own characterization. Second level of response. If it was inclusionary towards the rich people or towards the elite people, and it was only towards working class women, it's likely the movement would have a huge stigma on it, right? Because the rich women or the elites in society would just say, oh, you're overreacting. Oh, you should have just filed a court case. Oh, you should have gone to HR. And even if that movement did exist, it would have been incredibly easy to just dismiss the movement as some uprising of poor people, for example, that no one really cares about. Because it includes the rich people, because it includes high-profile cases, on our side, you can't just dismiss the movement as a whole. You can't just say that it's just some fling that some people are doing, trying to change society or something like that, when it won't really happen. On our side, that's the only time it happens. We told you, when the rich and privileged people started it, they got the media attention. They got discussions about Me Too. They made it trending and okay for you to discuss these things. It's incredibly unlikely any of these things would have happened on their side. They assume they have the same political capital and social capital. No, they wouldn't have those things. They never proved why that was the case. Then they said, working class women currently can't speak up. The key voices of the rich people drown out the voices of the working class women. This is completely untrue. Firstly, we told you, by increasing by having the rich and privileged people talk about it, you increase the pie of the whole Me Too movement. You allow much more people to speak about the whole Me Too movement. Why? What does this look like? This looks like, firstly, more media attention about Me Too, which means more people know about the movement. Secondly, this means more people follow the hashtag, more people understand the power of the hashtag or what it means, and all of those things, right? What does this all mean? This all means increased discussion, increased normalization, and increased attention towards the Me Too movement. That wouldn't have existed on their side if those people weren't the ones talking about it first. That means you would have no media coverage at all for anyone who wasn't the richest and most powerful sexual harassment cases. That means no one would have cared about these people, and those are all much more likely on their side. Secondly, even if you assume that to a certain extent, the working class women's voices are drowned out because people care more about the rich voices, we think that's fine. Why? Because working class women don't need to get the most likes, don't need to get the most media attention to actually get the change that they need to get. They're not going after Harvey Weinstein. They're not going after the most powerful people on the planet, right? What they're going after is their bosses, their managers. Even if that's only shared or like a couple hundred times, that's enough for the pressure the company to change the situation. In most cases, that's enough for them to fire the manager, or at least reprimand them, or at least get some level of justice that they would have never gotten on their side. You have to recognize, look, using their own logic, their comparative makes no sense. It's much worse for working class women on their side. They're much less able to speak out because they likely wouldn't even have a movement to speak out in at all. Second issue, where do we get structural change? They said the Me Too movement only caters to the media industry, and this is bad. Firstly, this is completely untrue, right? Teachers, managers, bosses, and lots of individuals are constantly fired or constantly reported on the Me Too movement, right? The Uber CEO and lots of tech CEOs, which are decidedly not in the media industry, were all taken out because of the Me Too movement, because of the existence of the Me Too movement, right? Secondly, they said when no other industries have incentives to change, this is completely untrue, right? Because for various reasons, a lot of other industries would want to change, even if it currently only targeted the media industry, even if we assume their analysis, right? Because firstly, they're scared that the Me Too movement is going to expand to them, because they're scared that they're going to get boycotted if they have a sexual harassment case because of all the talk about sexual harassment, because of all the will surrounding sexual harassment, right? Secondly, a lot of these other companies and other industries want to jump on the sexual harassment thing, right? So a lot of universities started getting gender hubs. A lot of companies started getting like women's meetings, women's hubs, and all of these things because of the Me Too movement, because it gave them much more positive image. That incentive would never exist on their side because there's no positive image that they could get from being against sexual harassment. Thirdly, because of things like jurisprudence, because there are more cases filed by these richest women, and because the judges support these women because they have more powerful lawyers, it means that it's so more likely to get convictions on our side. It means it's much more likely a lot of these companies, a lot of these industries are more scared of sexual harassment. None of those mechanisms would have existed on their side, and they didn't really respond to any of those mechanisms at all, right? They just kept asserting their case without really responding to a lot of the things we were saying. We think, thirdly, even if it only catered to the media like institution or the media industry, We think there's a huge amount of working women in the Me Too in the media industry anyway. So we don't know why that's a harm, right? Harvey Weinstein's staff that reported him still got justice when Harvey Weinstein was taken to jail. Bill Cosby's assistants, which are decidedly working women, still got justice when Bill Cosby was taken out of power and put in jail, right? They're all still working class women. We don't even know why those working class women in the media industry would have gotten the same benefits on their side. So if you look at it on net, even if you buy their analysis, at least we're able to help the women in the media industry. They're not likely to be able to help even those women change the narrative or change anything in that society. Right? The next thing they argue about how to get structural changes. The Me Too movement doesn't want to be controversial. It should have become a political platform that pushed for economic reform for women and all these things. Firstly, it's untrue that the Me Too movement doesn't want to be controversial. In fact, the Me Too movement lives in controversy by outing people, by speaking about things publicly, right? So we don't know why that's true. Secondly, it's good that they don't focus on everything, because the feminist movement's job is the one to focus for like fighting for the rights of all women and fighting for all women. Right? It's not the Me Too movement's job. The Me Too movement's job is specifically with regards to sexual harassment. Right? On their side, if the Me Too movement became a political platform, it's so much more likely to have been weaker and even worse for sexual harassment. Right? Why? Firstly, sexual harassment is a universally supported topic by most people. Most people are willing to support the Me Too movement because they're against sexual harassment as well. If the Me Too movement became a political platform that also supported economic reform or distribution of wages or more women inclusivity, it's highly unlikely they would have gotten the same amount of support. It's highly unlikely they would have gotten the same amount of traction, right? People could just call them communists. People could just, and all those things, right? Secondly, it distracts from the message of sexual harassment, right? Because people no longer care about it's no longer just about sexual harassment. The entire voice of everyone within the sexual harassment part of it would have been drowned out. So those working women on their side would have been drowned out as well. More than all of this, thirdly, it's incredibly unlikely they would have been able to get any change, right? Because no one cares what the feminist movement's opinion is if it's not about a gender topic. They care more if it's about they care more about economics major stuff, giving advice about economics and all these things. It's highly unlikely they would have cared about the opinion of the Me Too movement on economic reform and all of those things. It's incredibly unlikely they would have been able to get change on their side. It's much more likely they would have diluted the movement and given it a lot more harms. The last thing they said is, you give the appearance of growth and change, and that's bad. We think it's highly unclear why that's true. A lot of this change had no impetus to begin with on their side. No one was reporting sexual harassment cases. Everyone thought sexual harassment cases were really small and were fine. It's only with the advent of this movement that we recognize how big the problem is, and that's the only time we got the impetus for growth and change. Last issue, where do we get psychological healing? They said working class women can't relate because the person reporting it is rich. We think firstly, it's highly untrue, right? Sexual harassment happens in largely the same ways. It's still more powerful men. It's still their bosses. It's still being touched inappropriately. It's still inappropriate jokes being done onto you. It's still being touched and molested and all these things, right? We think, in fact, it's highly relatable for women. Secondly, it's likely even more relatable, right? Because if even powerful women can be sexually harassed, then you yourself aren't just an outlier, right? You can relate. All women are likely sexually harassed. It leads to more discussions and more normalization for you speaking about these topics. This means that it's so much more likely women on our side feel normal about sexual harassment, like they feel like it's okay that they were sexually harassed and it wasn't their fault. It's more likely they're able to talk about it with their friends and do all of these topics. Those things wouldn't have existed on their side. Thank you.
Highlighting the opposition whip. Let's have Op reply here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm pretty sure we won this debate. And the large reason for it is that the affirmative team, whenever they're not able to respond to our arguments, decide to shift their stance conveniently to make it likely for you to be able to win. I will explicitly point that out in my reply. Firstly, on the issue of representation, they say that they would have preferred a movement that prioritized the working class, prioritized the stories of the people who are poor and disenfranchised. We said that assuming that that would have been the movement, that would unlikely become successful in the medium to long term, because you're not likely to get the traction you need to continue sustaining the change. You're likely to be quashed. You're likely to be harassed by different businesses because they know that they can take you down because of all these structural reasons coming from affirmative. The working class are underprivileged. That is why the strategy of the movement had to be a mix of both privileged women starting and lighting the stories, and then other people entering the stories and aligning with the stories of Me Too. The response coming from Third Affirmative was damaging to their case. They said that it is fine because before they're popular, so now we can shift our strategy. This debate is not a policy debate about shifting strategy. The wording of the motion is whether or not the Me Too movement has failed. So therefore, it is a retrospective analysis of the debate where whether or not the Me Too movement in the past has been successful. To a degree that they concede that they're likely to get the support, they're likely to get the popularity only if we have this strategy, they lose this debate already because they're not able to explain to us how their grassroots working class Me Too movement that's exclusive to these stories are likely to be successful. But note, this also harms their case with respect to the fact that they claim about re-traumatizing people because they tell them that they have to relive their stories by coming out. If their model is they want working class stories to be heard, then the trauma will still exist under their side of the house, assuming that that is a harm. So to the degree that you're willing to judge this debate on the basis of trauma, that shouldn't be a factor because both sides want people to tell their stories. The difference on both sides is whether or not who should be the one telling these stories in the very first place. That's why we win the issue of representation. But secondly, in structural reform, note that at best, they assert that structural reform has barely happened or has not really happened under our side because they say it only focused on the media. Independent of whether or not this debate exists only in the media, that only constrains the scope of the debate, not explain why structural reform is unlikely to happen. We explain that there's institutional reform, legislation being passed to reduce sexual harassment because people realize it's a politically viable issue. We said, even if the movement itself does not intend for structural reform, and I think this is the greatest strength of their analysis, right? They say the movement focuses on individual stories and not focus on structural reform. So even if we believe that this is only about the movement not intending for structural reform, we said the outcome of it leads to structural reform because of things like the signaling effect, where the employers themselves want to adjust because they fear that they're going to be next in the Me Too movement's call-out list, or the fact that institutions want to realize there's problems they have to solve, or employers or bosses want to fix their problems, and therefore structural reform is fixed. This is important because if you're undecided about the issue of representation, structural reform benefits even the working class women and therefore able to get a net benefit for these working class women when affirmative is not able to provide a net harm. But lastly, on psychological healing and support. And I think we win this issue quite clearly because we gave you all the reasons as to why it's important to see stories of fellow victims of sexual harassment. Their only response was to say, well, they have different stories from you and therefore not able to relate. The third negative explained why even if you have different stories, one, that does not mean that there are no similarities that you can relate with. But secondly, the fact that it is privileged women being harmed is actually a good narrative for you as an underprivileged woman. Knowing that even the most powerful can fall means that you're far more likely not to blame yourself that you're sexually harassed because it's not your fault, because even if the strongest, most powerful quote-unquote women are able to be harassed, it is a problem. But even if you believe this response, at best it mitigates the argument, but does not explain why when instances when women themselves who are middle class or working class talk about their stories, or when women find similarities, they're able to get the psychological healing. If you're uncertain about the structural reform, if you're uncertain about the initial issue about representation, this is a clear issue that negative takes, and that's why we have to take this debate. We're very proud to negate. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the reply. To conclude the debate, let's have Gov reply here.
Three questions in reply. Firstly, did we need to prove an active harm? Secondly, has the current movement led to structural change? And thirdly, has the movement actively harmed working class women? Firstly, do we need to prove an active harm? I would note here that, like, as the affirmative team, we are allowed to set the benchmark by which we judge the debate via fear. We do this by telling you about it has failed in terms of its very narrow focus. We tell you how it's failed in terms of detracting from structural reform by making the problem out to be individualized. We tell you that it has failed by stealing the platform to actively misrepresent what sexual assault looks like. We tell you that leads to a structural block in reform. That is a failure. I think there are two important things to note now in terms of how you should judge this debate, though. The first is that this is simply not a regret debate. The movement still exists in our world. And despite the negative team's attempt to misrepresent what we said, we tell you down the bench that we were quite happy for the movement to start off as being with high-profile women and high-profile abusers. The point at which it has failed is the one in which it fails to use that immense political capital and support it now has to pivot into being a political movement, to pivot into one that is able to structurally reform things on behalf of working-class women that we have proven it is systematically ignored. That was the point at which the Me Too movement failed these women, and that was the nuance of our case that the negative team simply do not engage with and try to bluster their way through instead of actually having this debate be judged on its merits. Second thing to note here in terms of there was a bit of a definitional clash over what failure constitutes here. I think literally just reading from the info slide, the active goal of the Me Too movement is to fight against sexual harassment and sexual assault. And at the point at which we prove that it is ineffective in helping working class women avoid those catastrophic harms, we prove that it is a failure. So it wasn't really clear what their push was here. You should take away here, though, particularly importantly, about about the nature of our case and how we were happy for the movement to transition after a period of time. And that is something that you need to engage with, that the negative team needed to engage with and did not. Second question then in reply, has the current movement led to structural change? Noting that the negative team by their own framing and like quite explicitly tell you if they prove this, they win. Obviously, if they don't prove it, they also just by default lose. They have 4 large pushes here. The first is that like the social media nature of the movement makes it is quite accessible. But we give you 3 responses to this that they never adequately defeat. The first is that it is not accessible for working class women who are working 2 jobs to keep their family fed, who don't have the capacity to like build a Twitter following to get that social media presence and social media clout that will enable their story to be heard on a reasonable platform. We tell you that comparatively, only the movement itself is capable of doing that with its by pivoting and transitioning. Secondly, we tell you that these women are incredibly open to retaliation from their bosses and employers, so they're incredibly unlikely to buy in. Thirdly, we tell you it's incredibly re-traumatizing for them to try and do this, so they're obviously not going to opt in at the point at which the movement does not speak to women like them. And we would know that even if you do, so that means that it is incredibly inaccessible for these women. They also tell us, secondly, about how there is institutional change in giving examples of universities and companies. And this just completely ignores what we tell you literally in the first 20 seconds of my speech about who working class women are. If you can go to university, if you're working in a company as a professional, you are not working class. You are not who this debate is about. We are talking about the absolute most vulnerable people, the absolutely least educated people. They never engage with the true characterization of this debate. They tell us thirdly that you can target whole circles and that's structural, but Lockie tells you in his speech why that is still individualistic. It is literally 1 degree of separation removed. And even then, you are still not talking about working class women. Harvey Weinstein's cronies and Harvey Weinstein's victims were similarly rich. Overall, and they finally tell us there's a chilling effect because bosses fear and change their behavior. But we tell you the benefit's greater on our side because if you're the top 1% of bosses are getting cancelled for sexual assault, that doesn't trickle down. Nobody's going to cancel a regional Ohio McDonald's manager because they simply do not have the clout to be cancelled. What that fundamentally means is that all of their material just immediately falls out of the debate because there is 0 practical change, even if working class women buy into the movement, which we prove they currently do not. Finally, then, let's talk about the actual harms we prove that they never engage with. I'm just going to whip these really quickly. It forces the norm that you must come forward and out your attacker and re-traumatize yourself. We tell you it actively misrepresents the nature and extent of systemic sexual violence. We tell you it steals a platform and oxygen from more vulnerable women and necessarily excludes them from the movement. We tell you it leads to worse discourse and the impression that we've solved sexism and causing people basically think, well, there's no more need for me to do anything. So even if you buy their framing, we still win this debate and we win it clearly.